I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.
So we had the closing speeches yesterday, Clodagh, and just for people who don't know how a murder trial works, both the prosecution and defence laid out kind of their summary of the cases. And then today we'll have the judge will sum up the case, give some legal directions, and then the jury could in theory go out today. So we really are approaching the end of the case. The prosecution sort of laid it out that it was... they laid out a couple of really key bits of evidence, didn't they? They focused in on a couple of things.
They did, yeah. So I guess yesterday we start off with the prosecution's closing speech. Mr. Brendan Grehan was the senior counsel for the prosecution for the state. And he started his speech by summarising the fact that the case happened 42 years ago. So at the time, the accused Noel Long was 32 years of age. He's now 74. This happened in 1981. He was only charged with the murder in 2021. And he kind of spoke to the jury about the unfairness, that they might feel some unfairness about putting somebody on trial for something that happened so long ago. But he did specify that there is no statute of limitations on murder charges. Yeah,
so like a statute of limitations would be, people are really used to seeing it from TV, where there's very strict sort of statute of limitations in the US, where if you're not charged within a set period of time, say 5 to 10 years, the case can't be brought. Like in Ireland, certainly in serious sex charges or in murders, there's no statute of limitations. So, but they do the court does then recognise that there was kind of, that can be unfair, or that, that can be an issue in the case. But it does ultimately say there is no time limit. So he did address that, did he? That
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, they did also address the fact that because of the delay in the case, I mean, this was addressed earlier on during some of the trial, the fact that it is a little bit older. I mean, the case, it only went to the Serious Crime Review Team in 2008. There was previously a law that was only brought into place in 1992 that meant anyone who was deceased, their evidence can be brought forward into a trial. So only when that came into play, now it's, they can have evidence from the photographer who's dead, the doctor who did the original post-mortem. That evidence can it didn't really come into the trial because he didn't sign his report, but it could have. Evidence from witnesses as well who's passed away, that's been able to come in. Whereas if somebody had died and this came to trial before then, it wouldn't have been able to be brought into the case, the evidence, especially given the age of the case, the fact that, I mean, we had one person on the stand was in their 90s. That we've got other people in their 80s who were on the stand. And again, that was something that was addressed in the defence. This is closing speech, which is something that we can get onto. But in this case, it was highly scientific. Like, a lot of the evidence is around DNA, and it's around debris, as they label it, from Noel Long's car being found on various items of clothing belonging to Nora Sheehan. So it is very scientific. And, Grehan did point out that DNA profiling, it can exonerate people as much as it can, indict people on charges.
He used the word inculpate, did he, or something?
He did, yeah. I took it down as incubate. I was like, I'll look this up later.
It's not a regular appearance on Crime World.
Yeah, I was like, I'll figure that out later. But, there we go.
So, I think did he say, that it doesn't hinge, from the prosecution's perspective, this case doesn't hinge on memories. It hinges on two real planks of evidence that according to the prosecution, allow it to be inescapable conclusion that Noel Long murdered Nora Sheehan. And he said one of them was forensic evidence and one of them was the DNA profiling.
The DNA profiling, yeah. So actually, on the point of evidence, he did also acknowledge that there was some exhibits missing. So there was over 200 pieces of evidence, or 200 exhibits that, and some of them are lost or unavailable, in the fact that obviously some of the exhibits are going to be statements from witnesses who've died. And while, it can be brought into trial, but they didn't bring in. You weren't seeing people on the stand giving their evidence.
They're not there.
They're not here to do it.
Exactly, and therefore they can't, from the defence perspective, they can't be cross-examined on it.
Exactly.
But it's allowed to be admitted, I think, and build a picture, I suppose.
Absolutely. And, he did as well say that all of the evidence that is needed to convict is available. Like he said, not to focus on what's not available. He should concentrate on the evidence before them rather than the matters that are not available to them. So he kind of went into the fact that Nora Sheehan was last seen after going to hospital. So we've spoke about that before. She had a dog bite. She was agitated and upset, but she had no other injuries really. She was bandaged up and given a tetanus and was sent on her way. She was offered stitches as well, but didn't take them. We heard that yesterday. What she was wearing, and witnesses, the nurse that attended to her that night was on the stand, and she said that she was wearing a dress, a coat, a hat with a ribbon and carrying a bag. And her son James said that she would speak to anybody. And she was seen at various times and places outside the hospital that night, before and afterwards. Now, the thing that comes into play here is that she was known to kind of approach cars, and what she would do is she was kind of, one person noted that she had shouted, "Open the boot, let out the body." She seemed to have kind of this peculiarity where she wanted to look in boots of cars for bodies. And that was something that came, a couple of people had said. She was also seen last seen at a place called Casey's Cross. And that night somebody had recalled that she'd previously heard Nora Sheehan saying that that all the bodies are down there beyond Casey's Cross. So another barman then seen her at 4 a.m. And he noted that he thought that she was in her 60s or 70s because of how well she was dressed. She was wearing that hat and that dress and that coat with her bag. And Grehan pointed out that the totality of evidence can be derived that she and her habit of engaging with traffic, that it was her.
And of course, from the prosecution's perspective, they're saying that they can also place Noel Long in the same area where the victim was, within a broad time frame similar, and that a lot of that was based on the fact that he visited a friend there, and that it was uncontested. I think it was described as.
Yeah, it was. The defence didn't contest that. It was that his friend, a man named Donald Boyle, who also took to the stand, and he said that Noel Long had called up to his home that evening in his Opel Kadett, which is the car that he was pulled over in a number of days after the body was found. So he was putting Noel in the town, in that area, on the evening of that Nora Sheehan vanished. And again, Grehan kind of did note that, Noel Long is not the most unluckiest man in the world. Like, when somebody is murdered, everyone in the world can be a suspect, but you use logic and you kind of break it down. Well, they were out of the country, they were in Galway, or they were, not anywhere near, and you kind of bring it down into this closer area, and then coupling that with the evidence that there was fibres and debris from Noel's car on Nora Sheehan's body, which again went uncontested, and the fact that his partial DNA sample was found in her vagina, that also narrows it down to him. So he was like, it's not a series of coincidences. This is what happened, and this is who it is that did it.
And that's, of course, the prosecution's case. I mean, they went into some of the figures around the DNA sample. I think they said the DNA profile is a 1 in 23,000 case of it not being related to. Now, there was some very technical evidence, of course, from both the prosecution and the defence about the DNA sample. But what's the sort of, how did the prosecution, present this evidence, I suppose?
Yeah, the DNA was, it's like, it is a complex science. We're not scientists. We're not able to exactly explain it 100%. But what happened was, back in 1981, when the original postmortem took place, Dr. Coakley took a swab from her vagina, and that was taken. And another Dr. Creedon, when he took it into Forensic Science Ireland, what he did was he basically was able to take the biological material from that cotton swab, and he placed it between glass and glued it together and kept it closed. And that went into storage in a fridge in Forensic Science Ireland and was retrieved in 2008. So they say, they're so grateful that he obviously had done that, because otherwise not all DNA evidence, but that particular piece of evidence, which is what they have left, that would have been gone. So basically what he did was he separated the male DNA from the female DNA. The male DNA was eventually matched partially. There was only a partial DNA profile in that sample. And that is put down to the fact that the case is so old, that DNA was taken so long ago. There obviously is bacterial activity in the vagina, and also the fact that, the DNA wasn't taken until, the body was decomposing. So there could be issues there as well. So once he was able to separate that, he had his, he was able to see that there was spermatozoa in the male sample, which was expected. And in the female sample, they were able to see that it was female, and they expected it to be because they knew that they took it from the vagina. Yeah. From there, they were able to match the samples. They believe that to be Noel Long's sample. They were able to match the vaginal sample to Nora Sheehan because they also had a blood stain belonged to her that they were able to test. It wasn't until 2021 into 2022 when they actually got a warrant to search Noel's home, where they were able to take personal items. And from here, they got the beanie hat that has been a huge part of this case. They were able to take a full profile, and it was matched to that sperm sample to say that this partially matched to Noel Long. Now, basically, they do a ratio to try and explain what the likelihood is. Yeah,
so
of
like
this.
I mean, the DNA, it's there's always a ratio.
Yeah,
where you're saying like nothing is a match like this 100%, no matter what. I mean, even in the most, in other cases where you could have it's a chance of 1 in a billion that it's not a match.
Yeah.
So it's never just as simple as A equals B, right? So there's always this ratio, which means that according to the prosecution and the experts they have produced, that this sample matches Noel Long within this degree of within this ratio, which is basically a normal odds of like you'd get on a horse 1 to 2.
Yes.
And in this case, of course, it's a much higher number according to the prosecution. So there's not an exact match is not what it is, but it's a match within the context of these numbers.
Exactly.
Well, now we're not great on numbers generally on Crime World, but give us what was said in court.
So what was said in court was that in Dr. Whitaker's expression, he said that the chances of somebody else having the profile was 1 in 23,000. Now that is based off the UK population. Yeah. Because like they said in court, you can't take a DNA sample from everyone in the world, so they kind of had to do it on their DNA database. Yeah. However, obviously in Ireland, we've got a very different population number. So translating it in terms of the Irish database, it would make it 1 in 20,000 that it matched. So, he did again go on about how DNA was such a good proven science. There was some issue about the fact that, or issue made of the fact that the method used by Dr. Whitaker was called low copy number method, which was something that he had developed himself along with another doctor, or he was, part of the pioneering team that came up with the method. And it was used it was only used for a very short period of time. It was used in the Omagh bombing case. Yeah. And because the judge in that case wasn't satisfied about the validity of the science, he actually paused it. They stopped them from using that method for a while until it was validated and they could go ahead and start using it again. But they only used it up until 2012.
Okay, so this is giving you the ratio.
Yeah.
The probability, I suppose, is what it is. So it's an exercise in probability. And obviously the defence, which you go on to now, the different version of that. But they're giving you this is a probability. And also then the defence case says, well, there's other bits. There's a 1 in 20,000 chance, but there's also then the fact that they can place Noel Long within the area at the time. And that they have these forensic samples from his car. So that's the overall picture of the prosecution case, isn't it?
Yeah. So, I mean, coming to the end of his closing speech, he said, what are the odds that it could have been somebody else who shared what Noel Long shared in this case, between the DNA and the Opal cadet being in the area? He said, here you have a man who happens to live a couple of kilometres away from Nora, and he happened to be visiting a friend close to where she went missing. He happened to own that car that was stopped. And there was also as well evidence given from the Garda technical team who had done the original forensic sampling of the car, that they had suggested that it had been recently cleaned. They seemed to have been recently valeted. And he also brought that into the closing of his speech, that he happened to own that car that was cleaned and was connected to Nora Sheehan by way of fibres of particles. He said, this is a man whose DNA sample is found to match the depositor of the sperm found in Nora Sheehan's vagina. Again, saying this can't all be coincidence. That it can't be that Noel Long is the unluckiest man. It just isn't a question of coincidence. He then went on to say, Nora Sheehan met her death by the man who assaulted her, and all evidence points in one direction, the inexplicable conclusion that she was murdered and her murderer is Noel Long.
Okay. And that was, that's their case, of course. And then the defence obviously come on and they give, you know, the case that Noel Long is there isn't evidence to convict him of murder. I mean, you know, one of the interesting, I suppose, things that they focused in on at the start was the lack of cause of death. Obviously,
Yes.
you know, I think they said that we can't even say that what happened was a murder, that it's been referred to as a murder throughout the trial for various people, but that is not proven according to them.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the defence only had one witness, and that was Dr. Mary Cassidy. What she did was, we heard on, you know, I spoke to Nicola about this in the last episode, but basically what she had to do was she had to take Dr. Coakley's report, the original pathologist's report. It was not signed. What she did was she took the original report by Dr. Coakley, she reviewed it in 2010, and she came to her own conclusions. Now, he wasn't trained as a forensic pathologist where she is. She was the state pathologist for a number of years, for a long time, 14 years, I believe. And she basically, you know, interpreted all the evidence. So she had body sketches, she had photographs of the deceased, she had all those samples, and she came to her own conclusion. And her conclusion was that she couldn't actually say exactly how she died. She put forward some possibilities. She said asphyxia was a possibility, but it wasn't beyond a reasonable doubt. She also suggested that perhaps she was smothered with a hand over her mouth, but there was no support of that hypothesis, in that there was no tearing of Nora Sheehan's lips. There was no purple face or petechial hemorrhages in the eyes, which would be very, very symptomatic of being strangled or asphyxiated. And he said, looking at the circumstantial evidence, it could only mean one thing, but it doesn't, because she couldn't definitively say how she had died.
Yeah.
You know, there is, you know, that question over, was it murder or was it an accident? Because she suggested as well that she was asked, you know, could she have had a heart attack or arrhythmia or something like that? And she said, while there was no details of the heart, there was no evidence of like blocked arteries or anything like that. But arrhythmia is something where the heart starts beating really fast out of nowhere. There was no evidence of that, and that generally isn't seen in kind of in a heart.
So I mean, the
that
defence are putting this forward then that without being able to definitively say the cause of death is murder due to, you know, whatever manner, that there are other possible scenarios, and that because of these possible scenarios, that means that something is not beyond a reasonable doubt. I mean, that was how they opened up their defence. They went through some of these, as you said, some of these other cases or some of these other possibilities of how this woman could have died. Then they focused it on the forensics and the DNA. I think they probably all, both the prosecution and defence, these agreed these are the three things: the cause of the manner of death, the forensic, the samples taken from the car, and then the DNA. I think the defence said it's wholly dependent on forensic science. And then they, you know, sort of maybe discussed the low count number DNA things, and basically said, you know, that in order to convict, you have to place an enormous degree of trust in science.
Yeah, so that is what he said. He said DNA evidence, to the extent that the professionals rely on, you need to ask yourself if you're sure that the DNA evidence from Dr. Whittaker was correct. He again specified it was a method with limited life cycle, and the use of that method outside a lab outside of the UK was limited. It wasn't something that was able to be done here in Ireland. That's why it had to be sent to the UK. Again, he mentioned how controversial it was during the Omagh bombing ruling. Again, he mentioned that the DNA wasn't quantified before testing, so they didn't quantify how much DNA they had before testing it. But we heard from Kristen O'Connor before from Forensic Science Ireland that one of the steps in forensic testing of DNA was to quantify how much DNA there is there. However, while it was never put to Dr. Whittaker that the result was wrong, the defence said it was up to the prosecution to argue that it is correct beyond a reasonable doubt. And he also mentioned that because there was this swab that went missing, and all of the DNA was used up by Dr. Whittaker, the defence had no opportunity to independently verify that the DNA on that swab was actually belonging to Noel Long. He also said it was important not to overstate the importance of the DNA. He said it's yet to be proven that a person's DNA is unique. Now, the only case where two people have the exact same DNA is when you're twins, because the egg is split in two in the womb. So that the DNA is the exact same in both. With twins who are unidentical, they both have their own sets of DNA because they are two separate eggs.
So I mean, he's basically he's putting to the jury that you know that this science that it's not necessarily understandable always to us, but that in order to convict somebody solely on this basis, that there is elements of doubt in there in the science of DNA. You know, and it's up to the jury to maybe, from his perspective, say that puts a reasonable doubt on the conviction.
Absolutely, like he did say, DNA and science isn't infallible.
Yeah.
And like, you know, another part of this was the fact that there was these paint flakes in the car. So I think there was over 40 pieces of paint and debris that were found in Noel Long's car were also found on different parts of Nora Sheehan's clothing and under her fingernails. And he said that while there was a match, again, it was important not to overstate that match, because he said none of the paint flakes were unusual or none of them were very unique in their own way. But again, he said that, you know, the ingredients of murder were twofold.
Yeah. He
went on to say that the prosecution must prove an unlawful killing, that her death was caused by unlawful means, and the time of the killing, they need to prove that the accused intended to kill. Whereas this is where it got kind of interesting. He said otherwise it's manslaughter.
Yeah.
He said the intent to cause serious injury. So the part of the definition of murder is that you intend to cause serious injury or death to somebody. So, you know, he was kind of talking about this, that there's no precise definition in law of serious injury, like there's no precise definition of reasonable doubt. It is up to the jury to determine that themselves. The prosecution can't say exactly how she met her death, but the only pathologist that they did hear from was Dr. Cassidy, and she was approached to give a report by the Serious Crime Review team. So he was just pointing out that she was approached by the prosecution to do this and not by the defence. And just because she was called by the defence instead of the prosecution, he asked the jury not to attach any less weight to her evidence. Her basic view was that the cause of death was unascertained, but she did put forward those different possibilities. She also put forward that she may have had a heart attack during the course of an assault, because we did hear evidence that she had been kind of beaten around the head, that there was injuries there, but there wasn't many internal injuries to her that could have caused her death either. But it is clear from the circumstances that she met her death by foul play.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a very interesting case. Obviously, the way it works then, the judge will sum up, he'll give legal directions, maybe, you know, give directions on stuff for the jury that they need to know, and then he send the jury out to deliberate. So we could expect a verdict. You know, there's no way of knowing these things, of course, but there could be a verdict in the near future, and we'll certainly continue to follow that. You're going down again today?
Absolutely. On my way down to the court at the moment. We're expecting the judge to tell the jury what will be on the charge sheet. So his charge at the moment is murder.
Yeah.
So yeah, we'll have a verdict within the next.
Well, it's always hard. Yeah. Well, even probably sooner. But these things are, how long is a piece of string?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, Clodagh, thanks very much.
Thank you, Niall.